Millionaire woman weds a homeless stranger despite her ex. But his secret identity changes everything. Victoria Sterling had built her empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation that dominated Silicon Valley. At 34, she commanded boardrooms with the same precision she used to navigate Manhattan's bustling streets in her custom Louboutin heels. Her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park was a testament to her success. Floor to ceiling, windows, minimalist decor, and walls lined with awards that spoke of her relentless ambition. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Victoria sat in her pristine living room, staring at her phone screen with trembling hands as gossip blogs exploded with images of her ex-fiancé, Marcus Blackwood, wrapped around his 22-year-old secretary at the Met Gala. Same gala where Marcus was supposed to accompany Victoria, the same gala where she had planned to announce their engagement to New York's elite. The humiliation cut deeper than any business rejection ever could. Marcus hadn't just left her, he had orchestrated a public spectacle, ensuring that every society page would carry the story of how Victoria Sterling, the ice queen of tech, had been discarded for a younger, more pliable woman. The headlines were already writing themselves. Tech mogul's heart breaks like her stock prices never could. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had given Marcus everything: her trust, her vulnerability, even access to her inner circle. In return, he had treated her like another acquisition to be leveraged and discarded when something better came along. The rain began to fall against her windows, each drop echoing the rhythm of her wounded pride. Victoria had always prided herself on being untouchable, on building walls so high that no one could hurt her. But Marcus had found the cracks in her armor, and now she felt exposed, raw, and utterly defeated. Unable to bear the suffocating silence of her apartment, Victoria grabbed her coat and headed into the stormy New York night. The city's energy usually invigorated her, but tonight it felt like a mirror reflecting her own chaos. She walked aimlessly through the rain-slicked streets, her designer shoes clicking against the pavement in a desperate rhythm. It was outside the courthouse on Foley Square that she first saw him. Huddled beneath a thin blanket, a man sat against the granite steps, his weathered face illuminated by the streetlight. His clothes were worn and patched, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to contrast sharply with his circumstances. Despite his rough appearance, there was something dignified about the way he held himself, as if poverty was merely a costume he wore rather than his true nature. Victoria paused, studying this stranger who seemed untouched by the storm raging around them both. An idea began to form in her mind: reckless, impulsive, and completely unlike her usual calculated approach to life. If Marcus wanted to play games, she would show him that Victoria Sterling could be just as unpredictable. She approached the man, her heart pounding with a mixture of desperation and determination. His name was David, he told her quietly, and he had been living on the streets for months. There was no self-pity in his voice, no desperate pleading for help, just a simple acceptance of his situation that intrigued Victoria even more. The courthouse behind them was conducting late-night civil ceremonies, and Victoria found herself proposing the most outrageous plan of her life. She would pay David $10,000 to marry her right now, tonight, in a ceremony that would be legally binding but emotionally hollow. It would be the ultimate revenge against Marcus, showing the world that she was so unbothered by his betrayal that she had immediately moved on to someone else. David studied her with those penetrating eyes, and Victoria felt as if he could see straight through her expensive facade to the wounded woman beneath. But he nodded his agreement, perhaps understanding that they were both seeking escape from their respective prisons. Within an hour, they stood before a tired-looking justice of the peace, reciting vows that felt surreal in their spontaneity. Victoria Sterling, tech billionaire, was marrying a homeless stranger whose last name she didn't even know. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years building an empire, only to make the most important decision of her life in a moment of broken-hearted impulse. As they signed the marriage certificate, Victoria felt a strange sense of liberation. She had always lived her life according to careful plans and calculated risks. Tonight, she had thrown caution to the wind, and the rush was intoxicating. She handed David an envelope containing the promised payment, expecting him to disappear into the night with his newfound wealth. But David surprised her by pocketing the money without counting it and asking quietly where she planned to go next. Victoria realized she hadn't thought beyond the ceremony itself. In her quest for revenge, she had forgotten that marriage, even a fake one, came with complications she hadn't considered. They ended up at an all-night diner in Queens, sitting across from each other in a red vinyl booth that had seen better decades. Victoria found herself studying her new husband's face, searching for clues about the man she had just legally bound herself to. David ate his meal with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to take food for granted, but his table manners were impeccable, suggesting a background that didn't match his current circumstances. As the night wore on, Victoria began to sense that David was harboring secrets as significant as her own. The way he held his coffee cup, the measured cadence of his speech, the occasional glimpse of expensive dental work when he smiled, all of it suggested a man who was playing a role just as carefully as she was. But Victoria was too caught up in her own drama to investigate further. She was already planning how to reveal her marriage to the world, imagining Marcus's face when he discovered that she had moved on so completely that she had married someone else within hours of their breakup. The thought filled her with a savage satisfaction that she hadn't felt since closing her first major business deal. Little did Victoria know that her impulsive decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the price of pride. As she sat across from David in that dingy diner, she had no idea that her homeless husband possessed secrets that would make her billion-dollar empire seem insignificant by comparison. The morning after her impulsive wedding, Victoria woke up in her penthouse with a pounding headache and the crushing realization that she had legally married a complete stranger. The marriage certificate lying on her nightstand served as tangible proof that her moment of reckless revenge hadn't been a dream. She had expected to feel triumphant, but instead, she felt hollow and foolish. David had insisted on staying in a hotel rather than coming home with her, a decision that both relieved and puzzled Victoria. Most people in his situation would have jumped at the chance to experience luxury, but David had politely declined, saying he needed time to process their unexpected union. His dignity in the face of his circumstances had been surprising, but Victoria attributed it to pride rather than breeding. Over the next few days, Victoria threw herself into the business of making her marriage public. She hired a team of publicists to craft the perfect narrative, a story of unexpected love that would overshadow Marcus's betrayal. Photos of her and David were carefully staged and released to gossip columns, each image designed to convey romance rather than revenge. The media response was explosive. Headlines screamed about the billionaire's whirlwind romance, with speculation running wild about David's identity and background. Victoria watched the coverage with grim satisfaction, knowing that Marcus would be seething as he watched his carefully orchestrated humiliation backfire spectacularly. But as the days passed, Victoria found herself genuinely curious about the man she had married. David had moved into a modest apartment in Brooklyn, paid for with the money she had given him, and he seemed to be adapting to his new circumstances with surprising grace. When they met for their staged photo opportunities, Victoria noticed details about him that didn't quite fit the narrative she had constructed. David's hands, despite being weathered from street life, bore the telltale signs of someone who had once worn expensive rings. His vocabulary was extensive and sophisticated, peppered with references that suggested a classical education. Most intriguingly, he seemed completely unfazed by the media attention, handling photographers and reporters with the poise of someone accustomed to public scrutiny. Victoria's first clue that David wasn't who he seemed came during a charity gala she had insisted he attend as her husband. As they mingled with New York's elite, Victoria noticed several older businessmen doing double takes when they saw David, their faces registering recognition, quickly followed by confusion. One elderly man approached them, staring at David with undisguised shock. "David Whitmore?" The man whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "Is that really you?" David's entire demeanor shifted in that moment. The careful humility he had maintained vanished, replaced by the commanding presence of someone born to wealth and power. He greeted the man warmly, but with an undertone that suggested he would prefer not to be recognized. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she watched this interaction. Whitmore was a name she knew well. The Whitmore family had been New York royalty for generations, their wealth built on real estate, shipping, and shrewd investments that had weathered every economic storm for over a century. But David Whitmore, Jr., the heir to the Whitmore fortune, had disappeared from public life several years ago amid scandal and tragedy. That night, Victoria confronted David in his modest Brooklyn apartment, demanding to know the truth about his identity. David sat quietly for a long moment, studying her with those penetrating eyes that had first captured her attention. Then slowly, he began to tell her his story. David Alexander Whitmore Jr. was indeed the heir to one of America's oldest and most substantial fortunes. His family's wealth dwarfed even Victoria's considerable assets, built over generations of careful investment and strategic acquisitions. But 3 years ago, David's life had imploded in a very public and devastating way. His younger brother, Timothy, had been killed in a drunk driving accident, an accident that David had caused. The media had crucified him, painting him as a spoiled rich boy who had destroyed his family through reckless behavior. The truth was more complex and more tragic than the headline suggested. But David had been too broken by grief and guilt to defend himself, unable to bear the weight of his family's disappointment and the public's condemnation. David had walked away from everything. He had liquidated his accessible assets, donated the money to victim advocacy groups, and disappeared into the anonymity of homelessness. For 2 years, he had lived on the streets as a form of penance, trying to atone for his brother's death and his own role in the tragedy. Victoria listened to David's story with growing amazement and horror. She had married a man whose family's wealth made her own fortune look modest, a man who had chosen poverty as a form of self-imposed exile. The irony was staggering. In her quest to prove that she could rebound from heartbreak, she had accidentally married one of the most eligible bachelors in America. But David's revelations didn't end there. As he spoke, Victoria began to understand the depth of his intelligence and capability. Even while living on the streets, he had been quietly managing investments through intermediaries, turning his remaining assets into a fortune that rivaled her own. His homelessness had been a choice, not a circumstance, and he had the resources to end it whenever he chose. The revelation forced Victoria to confront her own motivations and assumptions. She had married David as a pawn in her game of revenge, never considering that he might have his own story, his own pain, his own reasons for accepting her proposal. She had seen him as a convenient prop rather than a complex human being with his own agency and dignity. As David finished his story, Victoria found herself seeing him with completely new eyes. The man she had dismissed as a homeless stranger was actually more sophisticated, more intelligent, and arguably more powerful than Marcus had ever been. The ultimate irony was that her revenge marriage had accidentally connected her with someone far more suitable than the man she had been trying to spite. But with this revelation came a crushing realization. Their marriage, built on deception and mutual manipulation, was fundamentally hollow. David had accepted her proposal because he had been seeking escape from his own demons, just as she had been fleeing from her humiliation. They had used each other as convenient solutions to their respective problems, never considering the possibility that their arrangement might develop into something real. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself drawn to David in ways she hadn't expected. His quiet strength, his genuine remorse for his past mistakes, and his determination to rebuild his life resonated with her own struggles. She began to see parallels between their stories. Both had achieved great success only to have it threatened by personal failures. Both had built walls to protect themselves from further pain. As they spent more time together, Victoria discovered that David understood her in ways that Marcus never had. He appreciated her ambition because he had felt the same drive. He understood her need for control because he had lost control so completely. And he respected her intelligence because he recognized it as equal to his own. But their growing connection was complicated by the foundation of lies their marriage was built on. Victoria had married David for revenge, while David had accepted her proposal as an escape from his past. Neither had entered their union with honest intentions, and both were struggling with the unexpected emotions that were developing between them. The story concludes with Victoria and David standing at a crossroads. They had both achieved their initial goals. Victoria had gotten her revenge against Marcus, while David had found a way back into society. But their fake marriage had evolved into something that felt increasingly real, challenging them both to decide whether they were brave enough to build something genuine from the ashes of their deception. Victoria realized that, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who could match her strength, understand her ambition, and see past her carefully constructed defenses. David had shown her that true partnership meant accepting someone's flaws along with their strengths, that love required vulnerability rather than strategy. As they faced the decision of whether to annul their marriage or fight for something real, both Victoria and David understood that their greatest challenge wouldn't be overcoming their pasts, but learning to trust each other with their futures. Their story had begun with revenge and desperation, but it had the potential to become something much more powerful, a love built on mutual respect, understanding, and the courage to be vulnerable with someone who had seen them at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. The millionaire woman who had married a homeless stranger to spite her ex had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most transformative love stories. But whether Victoria and David would have the courage to embrace that possibility remained to be seen, their future hanging in the balance of their willingness to choose love over fear, trust over protection, and truth over the comfortable lies they had both been living.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.